The twin suns of Xerion Prime cast an eerie crimson glow across the Obsidian plains as Commander Zara Vex stood atop the crystalline battlements of Nexus Station. Her cybernetic eye whirred softly, analyzing the approaching storm clouds that weren't clouds at all, but the massive invasion fleet of the Umbral Collective, a race of shadow-dwelling entities that had consumed 17 star systems in their relentless march across the galaxy. "Status report, Lieutenant," Zara commanded, her voice cutting through the howling winds that carried the metallic scent of approaching war. Lieutenant Cale Thorne, a young Xerioni with bioluminescent markings pulsing nervously along his temples, stepped forward. "Ma'am, long-range sensors detect approximately 3,000 Umbral dreadnoughts entering our outer atmosphere. Their void tech is interfering with our communications grid, and the planetary defense shields are already showing stress fractures." Zara's jaw tightened. The Xerioni had evolved on this harsh world over millennia, their bodies adapting to the planet's unique properties. The gravity was 3 times that of old Earth, and the atmosphere was thick with crystalline particles that gave everything a subtle, prismatic sheen. But evolution hadn't prepared them for the Umbral Collective. The enemy's ships descended like living shadows, their hulls seeming to absorb light itself. These weren't vessels in the traditional sense. They were grown, not built, from a dark matter substrate that the Umbral had learned to manipulate. Each ship pulsed with an organic rhythm, as if breathing, and their weapons were not lasers or projectiles, but concentrated beams of entropy that could age matter to dust in seconds. "Alert all squadrons," Zara ordered. "Initiate Protocol Obsidian. And may the Crystal Fathers preserve us all." The battle that followed would later be called the First Black Dawn, the opening salvo of a war that would reshape the very fabric of spacetime in this sector of the galaxy. Chapter 2: The Schism. 6 months earlier, the galaxy had been a different place. The Xerioni Federation, comprised of the crystalline-bodied natives of Xerion Prime and their allied colonies, had enjoyed a period of unprecedented prosperity. Their mastery of crystal-based technology had made them the foremost traders and diplomats in the Outer Rim, their ships carrying both goods and peace treaties across hundreds of systems. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the only human on Xerion Prime, worked in the deep archives beneath the capital city of Luminos. As a xenoarchaeologist, she had spent the last 5 years studying the ancient ruins that dotted the planet's surface, structures that predated the current Xerioni civilization by millions of years. "Elena, you need to see this immediately," called Professor Jorik Veltar, the lead Xerioni archaeologist. His massive, 8-foot frame moved with surprising grace through the narrow corridors of the underground complex, his crystalline skin refracting the bioluminescent wall panels into dancing rainbows. Elena followed him deeper into the archive, past shelves lined with artifacts that hummed with residual energy. They stopped before a newly excavated chamber where a discovery waited that would change everything. In the center of the room stood a monolith of pure black crystal, 10 feet tall and covered in inscriptions that seemed to shift and writhe when observed directly. But it wasn't the monolith itself that had excited Jorik. It was what lay scattered around its base. Dozens of small, obsidian fragments, each one containing what appeared to be preserved genetic material. But this wasn't Xerioni DNA, nor any other known species in the galactic databases. "The carbon dating is impossible," Jorik explained, his voice trembling with excitement and fear. "These samples predate any known life in this system by over 1 billion years. But Elena, they're not extinct. The genetic sequences are too perfect, too stable. It's as if they were designed to remain viable indefinitely." Elena knelt beside one of the fragments, her scanner detecting energy signatures that defied conventional physics. "Jorik, I think we're looking at evidence of a species that existed before the current cycle of galactic evolution. But if these samples are still viable, then they could still be out there," Jorik finished. Waiting. Neither of them realized that their discovery had already been detected by automated monitoring systems buried deep in the planet's core, systems that had been dormant for eons, waiting for the right genetic trigger to send a signal across the void of space. That signal had reached the Umbral Collective 3 days ago. The Xerioni had always prided themselves on their diplomatic prowess. When the first Umbral scout ships appeared at the edge of their system, the Federation's response was measured and peaceful. Ambassador Lyra Quill, a veteran diplomat whose crystalline skin bore the intricate scarification of someone who had negotiated with over 50 alien species, led the first contact mission. The meeting took place aboard the neutral trade station Meridian, positioned at the system's edge. As Lyra's delegation approached the docking bay where the Umbral ship waited, she felt an unusual chill. The station's environmental systems seemed to struggle against some kind of energy drain. The Umbral that emerged from their vessel defied easy description. Roughly humanoid in shape, they stood 8 feet tall, but their bodies seemed to be composed of living shadow. Where faces should have been, there were voids that seemed to absorb light, and when they moved, reality itself seemed to bend slightly around them. "I am Ambassador Lyra Quill of the Xerion Federation," she began, activating her translation matrix. "We welcome you to our system and hope to establish." "We know why we are here," the lead Umbral interrupted, its voice seeming to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You have disturbed the sleepers. You have awakened that which should remain buried." Lyra's confidence wavered. "I'm not certain what you mean. Perhaps if you could clarify." "The progenitors," the Umbral continued, its form seeming to darken the very air around it. "Your excavations have triggered their ancient beacons. They will wake. They will remember. And when they do, all light will be consumed." Before Lyra could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the station. The Umbral had vanished, not departed, simply ceased to exist in that space. And where they had stood, reality showed stress fractures, hairline cracks in the fabric of space-time itself. The war declaration came 12 hours later, transmitted directly into the minds of every sentient being in the Xerion system simultaneously. It wasn't a message in any conventional sense, it was pure emotion, raw terror mixed with implacable purpose. The Umbral Collective had come to ensure that the progenitors never awakened again. And if that meant sterilizing every world in the system, eliminating every trace of the research that had disturbed the ancient sites, then so be it. The Federation had 48 hours to evacuate all archaeological sites and surrender all artifacts of progenitor origin. They chose to fight instead. The first wave of Umbral ships hit the outer colonies like a plague of darkness. On Xerion Beta, a mining world with a population of 3 million, the attack lasted exactly 17 minutes. When it was over, the planet remained intact, but every living thing on its surface had been aged to dust. Buildings stood empty, their walls bearing the shadows of the people who had once lived there, shadows that seemed to move when no one was watching. Commander Zara Vex received the reports in the war room beneath Nexus Station, her staff of mixed human and Xerion officers struggling to comprehend what they were facing. The enemy's technology was unlike anything in their databases. Weapons that manipulated time itself, ships that could exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, and worst of all, the ability to corrupt and convert some of their own forces. "The Umbral don't just kill," reported Captain Thane Darkwater, one of the few survivors of the Beta attack. His left arm had been caught in the edge of an entropy beam, and now it was withered, aged 50 years in seconds. "They consume. They take the life force, the temporal energy, and add it to their collective. And our own people, some of them are changing." The phenomenon had been reported across the battle lines. Xerion soldiers exposed to heavy Umbral influence were beginning to show signs of what military scientists were calling shadow corruption. Their crystalline skin would darken, their bioluminescent markings would dim, and eventually, they would phase out of normal spacetime, becoming something between living beings and Umbral entities. "We need to accelerate the Obsidian protocol," Zara decided. "How many volunteers do we have?" Lieutenant Kale stepped forward, his markings pulsing with determination despite the fear in his voice. 12,000 across all services, ma'am. The Crystal Forged are ready for deployment." The Obsidian Protocol was the Federation's most desperate gambit, a process that would bond Xerion volunteers with fragments of progenitor crystal, creating soldiers who could operate in the same dimensional spaces as the Umbral. The process had a 60% fatality rate, and survivors were changed forever, their consciousness existing partially outside normal reality. But it was their only hope of fighting back. Chapter 5: The Crystal Forged. The transformation chambers deep beneath Nexus Station hummed with eldritch energy as the first batch of volunteers prepared for the Obsidian Protocol. Dr. Elena Vasquez worked alongside Xerioni scientists to monitor the process, her human expertise in xenobiology crucial to understanding how the progenitor crystals would interact with living tissue. "Remember," she told the volunteers as they entered the crystalline pods. "The ancient genetic sequences we found suggest the progenitors existed in a state between dimensions. The crystal fragments will allow you to access that same state, but the mental strain will be enormous. Some of you may find yourselves fighting not just the umbral, but your own perceptions of reality." Lieutenant Kale was among the first to undergo the transformation. As the pod sealed around him and began to fill with charged crystal particles, Elena watched his vital signs on her monitoring equipment. His brain activity spiked beyond normal parameters, his cellular structure began to resonate at frequencies that shouldn't have been possible, and then he screamed. Not with his voice, but with his mind, a psychic wail that every sensitive individual within 100 kilometers could feel. The crystal particles around him turned black for a moment, then brilliant white, then began to cycle through colors that had no names in any known language. When the transformation was complete 6 hours later, the being that emerged from the pod was still recognizably Kale, but changed in fundamental ways. His crystalline skin now had veins of obsidian running through it, and his eyes had become prisms that seemed to look into multiple dimensions simultaneously. "How do you feel?" Elena asked. Kale's response came not as words, but as a direct mental impression that bypassed language entirely. She saw/felt/experienced what he was experiencing, perception stretched across multiple layers of reality, awareness of the umbral ships not just as physical objects but as wounds in the fabric of space-time itself, and underneath it all, something vast and ancient beginning to stir in the deepest parts of the galaxy. "The progenitors," Kale said finally, his voice carrying harmonics that made reality shiver. "They're not just sleeping. They're trapped. And the umbral aren't trying to prevent their awakening, they're trying to ensure that when they do wake up, there's nothing left for them to destroy." The first deployment of the Crystal Forge changed the nature of the war entirely. Where conventional Xerioni forces had been helpless against umbral dimensional tactics, the Obsidian Protocol soldiers could engage the enemy on their own terms, fighting battles that took place across multiple layers of reality simultaneously. Commander Zara Vex led the assault on the umbral staging area in the asteroid belt, her ship accompanied by a squadron of crystal-forged and specially modified fighters. As they approached the enemy position, reality began to distort around them. The umbral had constructed what could only be called a temporal fortress, a structure that existed in 7 dimensions simultaneously, defended by weapons that could alter the past to prevent attacks from ever having been launched. But the Crystal Forge could see the fortress's true nature, perceive its vulnerabilities across all dimensional layers. The battle that followed defied description in conventional terms. Ships fought in normal space while their crews experienced the conflict from the perspective of beings existing partially outside time. Zara found herself commanding strategies that took into account not just current tactical positions, but how those positions might change if past events were altered by enemy weapons. Lieutenant Kale, flying a fighter that had been bonded with Progenitor Crystal, engaged umbral interceptors in a dogfight that spanned both space and time. His opponents would fire weapons that aged his ship's hull, but he would respond by phasing into a timeline where those shots had never been fired, then attacking from angles that existed only in alternate dimensions. "This is impossible," reported his wingman, another crystal-forged pilot named Sarah. "I'm fighting the same enemy ship across 12 different probability streams. It's like trying to kill a shadow while you're also a shadow." But gradually, the Xerioni forces began to gain ground. The progenitor crystals didn't just allow them to perceive multiple dimensions, they seemed to provide protection against the umbral's time manipulation weapons. More importantly, they began to understand what they were really fighting for. The breakthrough came when Dr. Elena Vasquez, working with a team of Crystal Forge researchers, managed to fully decode the inscriptions on the progenitor monolith. What they discovered rewrote their understanding of galactic history. The progenitors hadn't been destroyed or disappeared, they had been imprisoned. Billions of years ago, they had been the dominant force in the galaxy, beings of pure thought and energy who could manipulate matter and time at will. But their power had grown beyond their wisdom, and they had begun to reshape reality according to their whims, threatening the very structure of the universe. The Umbral Collective hadn't been their enemies. They had been their children, created by the progenitors as servants and soldiers. But when the progenitors' reality-shaping experiments threatened to collapse the local galactic cluster into a singularity, the Umbral had rebelled, working with other ancient races to imprison their creators in a pocket dimension. The prison had been designed to last forever, its walls strengthened by the belief and ignorance of younger races who had evolved after the progenitors' fall. But archaeological discoveries, particularly those involving direct genetic sampling, could weaken those walls. The Umbral aren't evil, Elena explained to the War Council. They're terrified. They know that if the progenitors wake up and break free, they'll reshape the galaxy into whatever twisted vision they've been dreaming for the last billion years. The Umbral are trying to prevent an apocalypse. But that doesn't excuse genocide, Commander Zara pointed out grimly. They're willing to wipe out our entire civilization to maintain their prison. Which brings us to our real choice, Elena continued. We can try to win this war through military force, but that might weaken the prison walls even further. The massive dimensional disruptions we're causing with the Crystal Forge could be the final key that unlocks the progenitor's cage. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. They were caught between two apocalypses, the Umbral sterilization campaign, and the potential awakening of beings who could reshape reality itself. The war evolved into something unprecedented in galactic history. On the surface, conventional forces still battled across the Xerion system, but the real conflict was taking place in the deep structures of reality itself. Crystal Forge soldiers fought campaigns in probability streams, trying to prevent the Umbral from altering past events that could weaken the progenitor prison. Meanwhile, both sides became aware of something else. Other races were taking notice of their conflict. Ancient civilizations that had remained hidden for millions of years began to stir, disturbed by the dimensional turbulence the war was creating. Captain Thane Darkwater, leading a reconnaissance mission to the system's edge, encountered something that changed the scope of the entire conflict. His ship's sensors detected massive structures moving through hyperspace, not ships, but what appeared to be entire civilizations relocating themselves. Ma'am, he reported to Commander Zara. We're receiving signals from races I've never seen in any database. There's something calling itself the Eternal Senate that claims to represent 12 different galactic civilizations. They're demanding that both we and the Umbral cease all dimensional warfare immediately. The Senate's message, when it arrived, was delivered by a being that appeared to be composed of crystallized starlight. It spoke in mathematical concepts rather than words, transmitting pure information directly into the minds of anyone who listened. The message was simple and terrifying. The war between the Xerioni and the Umbral had already begun to weaken the multidimensional barriers that kept the galaxy stable. If the fighting continued to escalate, particularly the use of progenitor-enhanced soldiers, the damage could cascade across the entire galactic cluster. But the Senate offered a solution, a way to end the war that didn't involve the destruction of either civilization. It would require cooperation between the Xerioni and the Umbral, working together to relocate the progenitor prison to a more stable dimensional location. The only catch was that someone would have to enter the prison first, to negotiate with the progenitors themselves. The joint mission was the most desperate gambit in the history of either species. A combined force of Crystal Forge Xerioni and volunteer Umbral would breach the progenitor prison using technology provided by the Eternal Senate, reality anchors that could maintain a stable portal into the pocket dimension. Elena Vasquez insisted on joining the mission. As the only human in the system, her neural patterns were completely alien to the progenitors, which might give her a unique advantage in communicating with beings who could alter reality through thought alone. The portal opened in the deepest part of space, far from any inhabited worlds. As the mixed team passed through, they found themselves in a realm that defied description. The prison dimension was a sphere roughly the size of a solar system, but space here followed dream logic rather than physics. Gravity pointed in multiple directions simultaneously, time flowed in spirals, and the very concept of distance was negotiable. At the center of this impossible space lay the progenitors. They were beautiful and terrible, beings of pure thought made visible, their forms shifting constantly between geometric patterns and organic shapes that the human mind wasn't equipped to process. Some appeared as vast mandalas of living light, others as fractals of crystallized concept. When they spoke, they did so in mathematics that rewrote the fundamental constants of reality in their immediate vicinity. New voices, the largest of them observed, its attention creating a pressure that threatened to crush the minds of the entire landing party. Children of children of children! You reek of the prison builder's touch. Elena stepped forward, her consciousness protected by both progenitor crystal implants and umbral shadow tech provided for the mission. We come to negotiate, she said, surprised to find that her words took on physical form in this place, becoming crystalline structures that hung in the air. Negotiate? Another progenitor, one that appeared as a constantly shifting equation of impossible complexity, focused its attention on her. You are insects. We are gods. When we break free, we will remake your reality into something more aesthetically pleasing. But as the conversation continued, Elena began to understand something the umbral had missed in their terror. The progenitors weren't unified in their desire to reshape the galaxy. Billions of years of imprisonment had changed them, split them into factions with radically different visions of what reality should become. Some wanted to restore the galaxy to its state before their imprisonment, essentially reversing evolution and wiping out all life that had emerged since their fall. Others wanted to merge all consciousness into a single, perfect Gestalt entity. But a third faction, led by a being that called itself the Architect, had become fascinated by the chaotic beauty of uncontrolled evolution. Your species, the Architect said to Elena, its forms cycling through impossible geometric patterns. Your random mutations and individual consciousness, we find this interesting. We had not considered that chaos might have its own form of beauty. The negotiation took place across multiple dimensions of meaning, with concepts becoming physical objects that could be manipulated, combined, and traded. Elena found herself literally holding ideas in her hands, weighing the value of different possible futures. The solution that eventually emerged was elegant in its complexity. The progenitors would be released from their prison, but under strictly controlled conditions. They would be given a small sector of space where they could experiment with reality shaping to their heart's content, but the rest of the galaxy would be protected by barriers that even they couldn't breach. In exchange, the progenitors would share some of their knowledge with the younger races, not the dangerous reality-altering techniques that had led to their imprisonment, but insights into dimensional physics, consciousness manipulation, and other sciences that could benefit galactic civilization. The umbral, meanwhile, would be relieved of their billion-year burden of maintaining the prison. They could finally stop being the galaxy's dark guardians and return to their own evolution and development. But the price for this peace was steep. The barriers protecting the rest of the galaxy would need to be maintained by volunteers from multiple species, individuals who would have to sacrifice their normal existence to become living components of the containment system. Elena looked around at her mixed team of crystal-forged Xerioni and shadow-touched umbral. They had all been changed by their exposure to dimensional warfare, existing partially outside normal reality. They were perfect candidates for the role. We'll do it, she said, speaking for the entire group. But we want guarantees. Full protections for both our civilizations, and a voice in how the new order is structured. The Architect's form shifted into something almost resembling a smile. Acceptable. But understand, you will be changed beyond recognition. You will become something new, something that bridges the gap between the old reality and the new. Your consciousness will exist across multiple dimensions, and you will experience time and space in ways your species was never meant to comprehend. Elena thought of the war raging outside the prison, of the billions of lives hanging in the balance, of the choice between 3 different kinds of apocalypse. Then she thought of the beauty she had glimpsed in the progenitor's impossible geometries, the elegance of umbral shadow tech, the crystal harmonics of her adopted Xerioni home. We understand, she said. Let's begin. The process of becoming a dimensional guardian was unlike anything the volunteers had experienced. even after their previous transformations. Elena felt her consciousness expand across multiple layers of reality simultaneously, her human perspective merging with Xerioni crystal resonance and umbral shadow manipulation. She was still herself, but also something more, a living equation that could perceive the fundamental structures underlying reality. Around her, the other volunteers underwent similar changes, their individual personalities becoming notes in a larger symphony of consciousness. The new Guardians took their positions at key dimensional nexus points throughout the galaxy, their combined will forming an unbreachable barrier around the progenitor's new territory. They could feel their ancient charges testing the boundaries, probing for weaknesses, but the barriers held firm. In normal space, the war ended as abruptly as it had begun. Umbral ships simply faded back into the deep void, their mission complete. The surviving Crystal Forge found their enhanced abilities stabilizing, no longer threatening to tear them apart from within. Commander Zara Vex stood once again on the battlements of Nexus Station, but now she was looking up at stars that held new meaning. Elena and the other Guardians were up there somewhere, existing in spaces between spaces, watching over galactic civilization with senses that could perceive reality itself. 5 years after the end of the Obsidian Wars, the galaxy had settled into a new pattern of existence. The Xerioni Federation had become the diplomatic center for what was now called the Guardian Alliance, dozens of species working together to maintain the delicate balance between the old reality and the new. Dr. Jorik Veltar, now promoted to head of Xenoarchaeological Services, led expeditions to ancient sites throughout the galaxy, but with new protocols. Every discovery was carefully evaluated for its potential to disturb dimensional barriers. The wild days of unrestricted excavation were over. The Umbral Collective had emerged from the shadows, establishing open relations with other species for the first time in millions of years. Their technology, particularly their mastery of dimensional engineering, proved invaluable in strengthening the barriers around the progenitor territory. But perhaps the most significant change was in the nature of reality itself. The dimensional warfare had left scars in space-time that had actually improved the galaxy in some ways. Travel between stars was now faster and easier, following paths that the Crystal Forged had carved during their battles. Communication across vast distances had become instantaneous in some regions where dimensional barriers had been worn thin. Young beings throughout the galaxy began to exhibit new abilities, limited dimensional perception, enhanced empathy that crossed species barriers, and in rare cases, the ability to manipulate probability streams. These children, born after the wars, were already being called the next generation by anthropologists and xenobiologists. Commander Zara Vex, now Admiral and head of the Guardian Alliance's military forces, received regular reports from the Dimensional Guardians. Elena's consciousness, distributed across multiple reality layers, could perceive threats that normal intelligence gathering would miss. Her warnings had already prevented 3 potential galactic crises from developing. In their carefully controlled territory, the progenitors had begun to create wonders that defied description. Entire solar systems reshaped into vast artistic installations, planets that existed as pure music made visible, stars that burned with the light of compressed dreams. But they had also learned restraint. The youngest generation of progenitors, those who had been born during the long imprisonment, showed a fascination with the concept of limitation. They created art within boundaries, explored the aesthetics of imperfection, and even began to experiment with linear time. The architect, now serving as the primary liaison between the progenitors and the outside galaxy, had established a research exchange program. Selected individuals from various species could visit the progenitor territory for limited periods, protected by reality anchors that prevented their minds from being completely rewritten. These exchanges had led to revolutionary advances in science, art, and philosophy. Xerioni crystal technology had been enhanced with progenitor insights into dimensional resonance. Human mathematics had been expanded to include equations that could describe the behavior of consciousness itself. Umbral Shadow Tech had evolved into tools for exploring alternate timelines safely. But the most profound impact was philosophical. The knowledge that reality could be fundamentally altered, but choosing not to do so, had led to new schools of thought across the galaxy. The concept of willing limitation, became central to ethics discussions among advanced civilizations. Elena Vasquez experienced existence as a symphony of possibilities. Her consciousness existed simultaneously in normal space, hyperspace, and several dimensional layers that had no names in any language. She could perceive the flow of causality across the galaxy, see how individual choices rippled outward to affect the fate of entire civilizations. Through her expanded awareness, she watched the growth of the new galactic civilization with something approaching parental pride. The species that had once existed in isolation were now interconnected in ways that went beyond simple trade or diplomacy. They were becoming something new, not a single unified entity like the progenitors had originally planned, but a complex ecosystem of consciousness that maintained diversity while sharing fundamental experiences. The other guardians maintained their own perspectives and personalities even as they shared in the collective consciousness of their role. Kale had become fascinated with the way individual choices created probability cascades, spending subjective millennia tracing how a single decision by a farmer on a backwater world might eventually influence the development of new technologies centuries later. The Umbral Guardians brought their own unique insights, their mastery of shadow and void allowing them to perceive the spaces between events, the silence between notes, that gave meaning to the music of existence. Together, they formed a distributed intelligence that could respond to threats and opportunities across the entire galaxy almost instantaneously. They were not rulers or gods, but gardeners, tending to the growth of something unprecedented in cosmic history. 1,000 years after the Obsidian Wars, the galaxy bore little resemblance to its former self. The rigid boundaries between species had blurred as intermarriage and cultural exchange created new forms of life and consciousness. Children who were part Xerioni, part human, part umbral, and part species that hadn't even existed during the wars explored realities that their ancestors could never have imagined. The progenitor territory had become a place of pilgrimage for artists and philosophers from across the galaxy. The ancient beings had learned to create beauty that enhanced rather than replaced the natural order, their reality-shaping abilities used to reveal the hidden wonders that already existed rather than imposing their will upon the universe. The dimensional guardians had evolved as well. Elena's consciousness now spanned multiple galaxies, part of an expanding network of protective intelligence that watched over the growth of what some had begun to call the universal consciousness, not a hive mind, but a vast community of interconnected but independent beings. The scars left by the Black Dawn had become bridges to new possibilities. The places where reality had been torn and healed were now gateways to exploration beyond the physical universe. Young beings with enhanced dimensional perception led expeditions into realms of pure concept and mathematical beauty. And in the deepest vaults beneath Nexus Station, now a monument to the war and a center of galactic learning, the original progenitor monolith still stood. But its inscriptions had changed, the ancient warnings replaced by new messages that appeared spontaneously, mathematical poetry written by consciousnesses that existed beyond normal space and time, describing the beauty they found in chaos, the elegance they discovered in limitation, and the infinite possibilities that emerged when power chose to serve wisdom rather than demand submission. The Obsidian Wars had ended not with victory or defeat, but with transformation. The galaxy had learned that even the darkest conflicts could become the foundation for unprecedented growth, and that the choice between order and chaos was a false dilemma. The real choice was between wisdom and power, between growth and stagnation, between fear and wonder. And in making that choice, an entire galaxy had chosen to become something greater than the sum of its parts, while still honoring the unique value of each individual voice and the vast chorus of existence. The wars were over. The real adventure was just beginning.